There was, in Sakart Velo, George, a king by the grace of God, happy, exalted, generous, modest, lord of many hosts and knights, just and gracious, powerful, far-seeing, himself a peerless warrior, moreover fluent in speech. No other child had the king, save one only daughter, the shining light of the world. To be ranked with naught by the sunny group who ever looked on her, she bereft him of heart, mind, and soul. It needs a wise man to praise her, in a very eloquent tongue. My day is done. Old age, most grievous of all ills, weighs on me. If not today, then tomorrow, I die. This is the way of the world. What light is that on which darkness attends? Let us instate as sovereign my daughter, of whom the sun is not worthy. Though indeed she be a woman, still as sovereign she is begotten of God. She knows how to rule. We say this not to flatter you. We ourselves, in your absence, often say so. Her deeds, like her radiance, are revealed, bright as sunshine. The lion's whelps are equal, be they male or female. For nearly 200 years, the unified kingdom and now Empire of Georgia had stood strong despite numerous setbacks. 8 kings in a near-perfect line of patrilineal succession headed the Bagrationi throne in Tbilisi, and before that Kutaisi. Most of these men would start their reign as boys, and most would die early. Most of these men were proven battlefield commanders, some much better than others. Most of these men had done their best, and it is through all of them that the Kartvelians were not only unified, but also turned into a proper medieval superpower. But it would not be a man that would oversee Georgia's most illustrious, most celebrated, most reminisced. The evergreen days would flourish with a female monarch. Tamar Bagrationi, Tamar Mepe, or Tamar the Great would lead Sakart Velo to its peak in territory, cultural advancement, diversity, and economic standing. A monarch so fitting for her time and place that Georgia's golden age seemingly starts and ends upon her life and death. Tamar Bagrationi was born in the year 1160, firstborn child of King George III and his wife, a beautiful princess of the Allans named Berta. By the time of her long-awaited birth, the king was already well into his middle age. While still an imposing figure, it was his duty as king to produce another king. He and the queen got right back into the sack, and around a year later, another child would be born. And she too was a girl. Tamar and the younger Rusidan would be the only children the royal couple would welcome. The issue of succession never ceased to be on the minds of the Darbazi Grand Council of Nobles. While Tamar would have no brothers, there was one man she regarded as such. The adopted son of the Bagrationi, Chiaber, would never cease to be the protector of his sisters, a role George III had likely groomed within him as his young foster son. Tamar would grow up in the royal palace in Tbilisi. She also is known to have made at least one small road trip in her early life. A small vacation in her mother's homeland of Alania would see Tamar meet her similarly aged cousin, the Alanian Crown Prince David Soslin. The two would end up being lifelong friends. Tamar, like her mother, was reported to have been very beautiful, which frescoes do portray, if you're into unibrows for this particular pose. But seriously, she was the standard of Georgian beauty and fashion for her time. Not only that, but Tamar was smart, already accustomed to navigating the delicate noble courts, especially as they joked and hushed sweet nothings about her being a king. Of course, seeing as there had been no ruling queen in Georgia, the Kartveli nobles got up to their favorite pastime of overthrowing their kings and replacing them with much less competent and more pliable candidates. The nobles, led by the notorious Marshal, Ivan Orbeli, presented George's nephew, through his brother, as their candidate, Denma Bagrationi. Only 4 years older than Tamar, and with a perfectly fair claim to avoid an unbroken male succession. But Ivan and Denma missed their ambush to capture the king, and were eventually surrendered after a long siege. Both men would be blinded. Denma, also castrated, would die from his injuries. The Orbelli name was declared illegal. All nobles who helped Orbelli until near the end would simply either be killed or exiled. But for many of these hereditary serf-owning elite, another member of their family did not replace them as duke. King George III needed unmeasured loyalty to push for Tamar to become the next monarch, and that's just what he found in some rather strange places. The marshal and treasurer would both be of Kipchak Turk origin. The former, named Kubasar, would inherit much of the Orbelli fief, while the progressively minded Kudallu Arslan would handle the financials. The Zakarian family largely replaced the Orbelli as the largest Armenian influence in the court, but they were now also handed a few, albeit much smaller, Georgian villages on their borders. The most shocking appointment was a peasant becoming the Grand Duke of Kartli, one of Georgia's most revered cultural centers. Apradon, despite his humble upbringing, appeared good enough at his new post, and better than his predecessor when considering the lay of his loyalties. Not only this, but Apradon also took on a completely new role in the government, the Majordamo, or chief official of the court, tasked with overseeing the appointment of individuals to assist the royal household and treasury. In 1178, the day had finally come for Tamar to be crowned as co-monarch, alongside her aging father. In the ancient cave city of Uplasiki, the long and most prosperous reign in the history of Georgia started. Tamar Mepe was born. The Georgian word for king, Mepe, has no gender associated with it in the Kartvelian language. Tamar is just the first and most formidable female Mepe. With her father, these two paragons ruled a realm of peace, and set about making everyday life better. First, they went on a rat extermination frenzy, and after that they killed the wild dogs. Then after that, they hanged bandits to trees directly next to the things they had stolen. Although seemingly small, these contributions were only to benefit in the long run. If the nobles wished not to accept Tamar, then they were certainly not showing it at the very least, and especially not with King George watching. For 6 glorious years, the Mepes reigned together, starting a cultural renaissance. The father and daughter duo would be heavily romanticized and viewed as the start of a golden age. And a great age it was for George in his own golden age. But in 1184, this would come to an end. King George III, feared and respected, would meet death after a long life and some 20 years of reign. The next few seconds, minutes, and days would be make or break for Tamar being able to hold on to not only her autocratic authority, but quite possibly even her crown and life. The first person to be informed of King George's death wouldn't be Tamar, as it should have been. Instead, it was her aunt and George's sister, Rusadan. Tamar was not the only she-wolf in Georgia. In fact, she probably learned the trade from her aunt. She had spent most of her life in 3 separate political marriages to various sultans of the Seljuk realm. She was well respected and presented herself as some kind of old and wise protector of Tamar. Now, with the knowledge of her brother's death, she very temporarily held the kingdom in her fist. And with this, she intended to instate herself as the true power behind her niece's throne. It's safe to say that the secret slipped. The most powerful nobles of the land learned of the king's death before even his 2 daughters. When the lone Mepe was informed, this sad reality for Tamar would, without hesitation, turn into years of power struggle for authority that her crown, title, and ancestry were supposed to guarantee. The nobility, in conjunction with the clergy and Rusadan, demanded Tamar be crowned as sole Mepe, which was reasonable enough and would only further her right as monarch. Except it would be two Grand Dukes she would receive the royal relics from, practically putting Tamar at their mercy without saying it outright. All this in Gelati Cathedral, among her most celebrated ancestors. As Tamar walked over the resting place of her great-grandfather David IV located at the very entrance of Gelati, and her father freshly buried, she knew that to preserve her illustrious dynasty, the next few years would be utterly crucial. With Tamar now at the negotiating table, the nobles suggested in a very demanding voice that Tamar reverse the Great Noble Shuffle, when her father exiled many of Georgia's oldest noble houses and replaced them with lower-class men and foreigners. In the years following that noble shuffle, Kubasar, the marshal of the army and owner of Orbelli Fief, had a stroke and was left partially incapacitated. The man could no longer fight, yet he was the head of the army. He was fired from this role, but was still respected enough to keep his fiefdom. He would be replaced by none other than Sargis Zakarian, who would remain in this role until his own death. At Pradon, the peasant Grand Duke of Kartli would return to his simple life. I really hope that guy enjoyed his 5 seconds of fame and fortune. He would be replaced by the mayor of Tbilisi, a wealthy merchant named Abulsan. In his dual roles, he would become one of the most important members of the new aristocratic order. As for the newly created role of Majordomo, his replacement would be the Duke of Mingrelia, also known as Samgrelo, Vardan Dadiani, the first member of this noble offshoot to be welcomed into the court. Kudulu Arslan, the Kipchak-born state treasurer, was demoted in favor of Kakaber Vardanistzi, the Duke of Svenetia, progenitors of two other major noble branches, the aforementioned Dadiani of Mingrelia, and later the Goreli of Goria. These three families would form another firm bloc in the Darbazi Council. While most nobles were hungry to reclaim their privileges, there was a select few who were tired of this centuries-long struggle between the Bagrationi and literally everybody else. It would take an outsider to see how this inner feud could be used to not only benefit Georgia, but pioneer a new form of government. Kudulu Arslan, a man many would come to call the Simon de Montfort of Georgia, although I wouldn't, set up a huge tent outside the royal palace, called it the House of Lords, and started persuading nobles to join the Georgian form of constitutional monarchy. Georgia had already had a long and ancient history of nobles who intended to check the power of their kings, something of an unofficial constitutional monarchy known as the Patron Kamomba. Patron Kamomba. Or literally translated to master and serf. This already dominated the court. Despite this, many of the less privileged nobles and members of the merchant class flocked to Arslan's tent. He was probably not gonna actually set up a constitutional monarchy, but this appeared more to be a grasp to keep hold of his power. Tamar ordered for his arrest, and the Kipchak did not fight back. But the nobles he had rallied to his government reformation refused to back down. They now threatened the country with revolt if Kudulu was not released. Two noble women were sent to negotiate with their revolutionary counterparts who encamped just outside Tbilisi. This, however, was only a stalling tactic for the opposing nobles to gather their own forces. Eventually, the time for negotiation had ran out, and all the nobles just surrendered. To avoid another clean slating of the class, Tamar either chose to or was forced to pardon them. Either way, Tamar would consistently choose forgiveness over violence, even when she was Mepe in more than just name. Even that slimy Kudulu Arslan was pardoned, although his name disappears from history, likely returning to his Kipchak brethren in the north. Little did they all know that Kudulu Arslan's proposed form of government would be the very thing that Georgia would become under Tamar Mepe. Not on paper constitution, but in a living and breathing power share, Patron Kamomba would reach its ultimate form. With revolt avoided, there was one man between Tamar and any power she might have over Georgian politics. The head of the Georgian church and practical prime minister of the country was an elderly bishop of 4 monasteries, and a well-traveled and apparently very busy man named Michael Marianidze. Michael was not loved nor especially hated by both the nobility and even the clergy. He simply did his job quietly. As the Shadow Master, he was the closest thing to a king at this point. He was only in this position because he forced the early retirement of his predecessors in both his roles, even ordering for the death of the brothers of the former chancellor, Anton Nolis Davidzi, to secure his spot. How could Tamar, a mere mepe, take down the Georgian pope who was running her government? She called a great synod. Every bishop and clergyman was to attend, save for Michael, of course, as he was the main topic of discussion. Tamar levied a case against Michael's monopoly of church and state, but the clergy concluded that the man had done nothing particularly wrong, and they were unfortunately right. This was Tamar's last independent act as a mepe, before she became nothing but a figurehead ruler. Michael couldn't allow Tamar to be in a position to oust him again, so he gave the noble council, the Darbazi, the right to approve royal decrees. The nobles were now the voice of the kingdom. But Tamar was not fully excluded from the government. She sat there listening to all of this, various men ignoring her ancestral power based on the fact of her gender. She always had opinions. The nobles could just choose whether or not they wanted to listen now. And just like that, all of Tamar's power base she initially split with her father was now under the sway of the clergy, nobility, and her Aunt Rusidan. But was Rusidan doing the power broking on behalf of Tamar in order to protect her, or did she simply grasp at power for more selfish reasons? This is a question many wonder. Either way, Aunt Rusidan showed Tamar how a strong Bagrationi woman could rise to the top. All it took was some intrigue and ambition. These 3 shareholders in the Georgian kingdom had very few to contest their gross mistreatment of Tamar. But one powerful family usually sided with her, the ever more influential Zacharids of Armenia. They were one of the only families who contested the marriage of the puppet master's choice. With the Byzantine Empire in severe decline, the only other Orthodox nation Georgia could realistically find itself marrying into was that of the Third Rome far to the north, the rising power that was the Russians. Russia and Georgia have had a mixed bag relationship for much of their shared history, the former having owned Georgia for much of the post-industrial period. But this near reverence on the Russian side and more than hate from the Georgian side goes back much farther than this. It all started nearly 1,000 years ago with a runaway Rorikid prince, whose life had simply been one long revenge story, and a beautiful queen struggling to reign in her court. While sounding like the start of a chivalric-filled medieval love story, I promise you this is anything but. A year younger than Queen Tamar of Georgia, the 24-year-old Yuri Bogolyubsky, a descendant of the Rorikid dynasty, would fit the needs of the nobility. To say that Yuri had a troubled youth, even when compared to Tamar, would be an understatement. After all, how else would a descendant of Rorik find himself all the way in the Caucasus? Yuri was the son of Andrei Bogolyubsky, the prince of faraway Vladimir Suzdal, a man who himself had come to power by exiling his 4 brothers to Byzantium. Later in his reign, he occupied Kiev for a few years, and after that he blockaded the trade ports of Novgorod, all the way towards the eastern end of the Baltic Sea. Eventually, the Novgorodians surrendered their city, and the 10-year-old Yuri was declared their prince. Here the boy stayed for 3 years until his father was on the losing side of a massive coalition built against him. Eventually, 20 of his own nobles rushed into his room and slaughtered him in his sleep. Novgorod then ousted their adolescent prince in a heartbeat. Hereafter, Yuri and a few loyal men made way for Vladimir Suzdal, only to find many of his uncles and cousins had returned from their exile with hopes of taking the crown from a child. Yuri would stay and fight, but would eventually be kicked out completely as he could not garner enough support for his cause. The fate of Vladimir Suzdal would be in the hands of Vsevolod III Yurevich, also known as the Big Nest. Yeah, his nickname was the Big Nest, probably something to do with his 14 or more children. At any rate, the young Yuri, despite proving himself as a decent enough general in his family dispute, had run out of places to hide. His relatives wanted his head, so he joined forces with a group of well-established Rorikid headhunters. He took shelter with none other than the Kipchak Turks and continued his war, proving himself invaluable to the nomads as both a warrior and a pawn in politics. From here, Yuri worked his way down the Kipchak Human Confederation until reaching the cliffs of the North Caucasus. Here, he remained for some years. Back in Tbilisi, Tamar's marriage was thrice agreed upon by her aunt Rusudan, Catholicos Michael IV, and most importantly, the mayor of Tbilisi, Abusan, a merchant who had not only connections with the Kipchaks but was also forming his own conspiracy. See, Abusan and a select few merchants in Tbilisi were heavily invested into stretching Russian influence all the way into Georgia. An effort that would likely improve trade, at least to the north, but would simultaneously put the empire at risk to just become another Russified satellite state. Abusan was the one who knew where Yuri was. He likely promulgated the idea and convinced the other two regent-esque rulers to his plan. Abusan was Yuri's long-awaited key to endless riches and powers, and this vice versa, but the merchant wouldn't let him have it until he sweetened the deal for him. The mayor of Tbilisi sent one of his close associates, another merchant named Zankhan Zorababali, a Georgian-born follower of Judaism who was notorious for the speeds at which his caravan would frequently travel. He retrieved Yuri from the Kipchaks and brought him back to the hot spring city in all haste. Tamar was reluctant to marry a complete stranger, but she was left with no choice on the matter. The kingdom needed an heir, lest they face an all-out dynastic war upon her death. This had to be avoided, even if it meant the end of a near 400-year reign of the Bagrationi. The pair would wed in 1185, an unhappy bride and a power-hungry groom. Yuri would become Mepe, while Tamar would become Mepada Mepe, king of kings and queen of queens. Truly the ultimate monarch, at least on paper. As had been agreed, Abusan was promoted to state treasurer, and was given even more land to add to his ducal possessions in Kartli. While Yuri looked like a king, strong, young, and handsome, his actions did not befit his title. A life on the road spent fighting his relatives on the run, not to mention being held up with the Kipchaks, made the young Rorikid rugged to say the least. An epitome of an unrefined royal. His mannerisms were completely opposite of his new wife. He was unaccustomed to Georgian culture, had no tact, and apparently got so drunk he committed sodomy, which could mean he fucked an animal or another dude. Both were not close to being acceptable in Georgia. Regardless of his personality, all the nobles were eager to witness his battlefield skills, seeing as this was his new job as king. The mercenary turned monarch with a proper army supporting him made the march south where the enemies of Georgia were numerous, and still full of fear from the legacy of King George III. Tamar followed the army like any Mepe would, but she would stay back at the last Georgian church deemed to be a safe distance from the enemy. Yuri would lead the rest of the way, going into completely uncharted territory for him. But of course, with the expert advice of Marshal Sargis Zakarian, together they completely devastated the Algazid province of Devin. Taking his first glory and riches, it appeared Yuri was the right man for the job after all. In quick succession, Yuri struck at the Saltikids who controlled Erzurum. Here too, he raided the lands before making an enriched return trip, this time taking all the spoils with him back to Tbilisi. Marshal Zakarian would die shortly after this campaign. Having built his family name from the ground up, he would be survived by his two sons, Zakar and Ivan. Like their father, both would grow to become some of Georgia's finest commanders. But for now, he would be replaced by one Gamrikeli Torelli, ruler of two central Georgian duchies, an apparent favorite of Tamar Mepe. Inscriptions in Armenia survive that call Yuri, perhaps jokingly, as King George the Conqueror, and more often, George the Rus. Now the conquering king did what he did even better than war. Debauchery-filled celebratory drinking for the next whole year. I can just see Tamar shaking her head in disapproval. Now, taking a wider worldview, yet another one of Georgia's Christian allies had been severely weakened. The Crusader states had been reduced to but a few port cities. A Kurdish man, who made his base in Egypt, the rising eagle of the Ayyubids, conquered Jerusalem in 1187. Hopes of Georgian and Crusader forces squashing their enemies between them and retaking the entire Holy Land like a real Prester John was out of the question, at least for now. But Jerusalem was not only seat to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but there was an important Eastern Orthodox monastery as well. The Monastery of the Holy Cross would be built by a Georgian monk with the funds of Tamar's great-great-great-grandfather, Bagrat IV. Georgian envoys were sent immediately in hopes of saving their place of worship at the center of the Abrahamic world. In this, they succeeded in convincing Saladin, and moreover were treated with respect when compared to their Catholic counterparts. Georgians were allowed free passage into the city, with their five-crossed banner leading them, and swords at their hips. I can't understate how incredible that is. But Saladin needed a happy Georgia. He had crushed one Christian power, but could he crush another? After a year of getting absolutely lit in the opulence of Tbilisi's royal court, just about everyone had had enough of the partying Russian. Tamar demanded that the marriage be annulled, or there would never be an heir. For once, Catholicos Michael agreed, made the divorce official, and sent Yuri away with a sizable bribe to Constantinople. Surely the revenge-filled Yuri would never come back. Surely. Abulsan, the court treasurer who had orchestrated the marriage, would then lose all his titles and lands, and he would be replaced by the greatest poet in Georgian history, Shah Rastaveli, author of The Knight in the Panther's Skin, an allegorical epic that parallels the world of Tamar Mepe's reign. It reads like an Arthurian Odyssey, where the main character must go on quests far away, where, of course, the end goal is to take the hand of his true love. This story's version of Tamar Mepe. It is during his time as treasurer that he got an up-and-close, personal view of the Mepe he would one day write so much about. Unfortunately, the only contemporary image of Rastaveli, located in the Monastery of the Cross, was scratched out in 2004 by an unknown vandal. But we still got the pictures, so joke's on them. And seriously, whoever did that, just fucking get a life. Not long after annulling Tamar's marriage, the de facto head of church and state, Michael IV, finally died. It is said that no one was overly sad about this because with him gone, Tamar was finally given a chance to escape from her truly gilded prison. Michael's brother Theodore would become the next Catholicos, but he was uninterested in becoming a dictator. Tamar now appointed whatever loyal men she wanted in her court, in the most important spot at the top of her government. George III's chancellor or prime minister would be called back, Anton no less Davidzi, a warrior monk and personality on top of that. He would remain loyal to the Bagrationi. Tamar was reclaiming her power as Mepe, one step at a time. Now it was only those pesky and bloodthirsty nobles who wanted nothing more than a Mepe to lead them to battle, until the edges of the earth, because come on, that's the only way to quell these guys. Tamar was left to choose who she would marry this time. Her cousin and friend, the Prince of Alania, David Soslan, would become the next Mepe of Georgia. As a basis of approval, her aunt Rusidan would adopt David before the marriage, thereby making him a Bagrationi partially in both blood and name. In 1189, the new royal couple would wed, one of few political marriages of the Middle Ages that was founded on the premise of love alone. The name Soslan comes from the ancient Nart sagas, a mythology based on the world of the North Caucasus. Soslan just so happened to be the equivalent of Loki, a trickster who was sometimes an anti-hero. In the Ossetian language, Soslan directly translates into to look menacing, and that's exactly the role David would play in Tamar's court. Where Tamar was a forgiving beam of sunshine, Soslan would be the one who would order the death. Now, with a Mepe who actually had the best interests of his wife and country in mind, it is said that Tamar's reign would truly begin here. One of the medieval world's true power couples would face a particular and recurring problem during their honeymoon years. In 1190, after a year of recovery, the Saltykids took revenge on their raid by so-called George the Rus. They raided Tau before meeting its duke, Guzan, who drove the Turks back to Erzurum. And then, out of nowhere, good old Yuri pops back up with a band of mercenaries at Sultan Nasruddin's court and is like, hey, want to conquer Georgia? They team up and Yuri informs some of the contacts he had kept in secret with a select few noblemen. The three largest landowners in western Georgia simply handed their provinces back to Yuri. The chief of the Georgian court, Vardan Dadiani, the ruler of Samski, Batso Jakeli, and the aforementioned Guzan of Tau. This was a setup from the start. Together, they marched Yuri deeper into Georgia, intent on restoring the old capital of Kutaisi. Then they went into the very same Gagudi monastery where Kings Bagrat III to David IV were crowned. So too was Yuri crowned, this time as Mepe in his own right. Yuri's plan was to cut off and surround Tamar and Tbilisi by splitting his army in two, one in the south and one in the north. Both armies were moving at breakneck speed before Marshal Gamarakeli Torelli showed up with the Georgian army and defeated the rebels at Tomagvi. On their retreat, he decimated them at Ershuti. And then, he died. It's unknown if battle wounds had anything to do with his demise, but he would be replaced by none other than the current master of ceremonies. Tamar's foster brother, Chayaber, would become the next marshal. But he wouldn't see any action during his serving time. He was merely filling the role until Zakhar Zakarian, son of Sargis, was ready to take the mantle a year later in 1192. Soon, two of the rebel nobles that sided with Yuri surrendered themselves to Tamar and Soslan. They were Batso Jakeli, who would be replaced by his brother Ivan Jakeli, who would remain a powerful ally of the Bagratids for the next 50 years. One of few nobles to live through the Georgian Golden Age and utter destruction. Vardan Dadiani also surrendered. His family too would keep their lands, but his title at court would be given to the other Zakarian, the younger brother named Ivan. But these two rebels only agreed to hand Yuri over on the condition that he was allowed to live as a free man. Yuri was sent back into exile. Surely he would give up. I think I'm actually starting to feel bad for this guy. He should have been a ruler of 4 different countries from Novgorod to Tbilisi across 1,000 miles, but had gotten nothing. But in this case, at least, it is definitely his own fault. I mean, they bribed him and sent him away. Just live your life, dude. Even with Yuri now gone, Guzan, Duke of Tau, had not given up the fight, building an alliance with Shah Armenia and selling them his own land in exchange for soldiers. Where Torelli led the Georgians to victory in 1191, in 1192 Zakhar Zakarian would prove himself capable, bringing Guzan as a prisoner in Tbilisi. He was the ringleader and a clear collaborator with not just a rebel, but also the generational enemies. For this, David Soslan was left to fill out the punishment. Guzan would have his eyes gouged out and his lands confiscated. The armies also took the pleasure of retaking the land he had sold to Shah Armenia. This offered no serious response from the southern foe. By this point, Tamar was visibly pregnant. This was a blessing. After much fear, the line of the Bagrationi would continue. In 1192, George IV would be born. And with that, the 50-year period of wondering who the next king of Georgia would be ended. George was the destined king, the one who would take this golden age and run with it. He was born to be the greatest king in Georgian history. It's safe to say that the country, Tamar, and Soslan adored their son. His nickname sums up the idea better than anything: Lasha, or illuminator of the world. George Lasha was born in the heights overlooking Tbilisi, a place where Georgians still gather to celebrate Saint King Tamar Meppe's day. With Tamar's powers as sovereign restored, although never at fully autocratic levels, her usurping ex-husband exiled, a husband she loved who was himself respected, a healthy newborn son, with her war-hungry and ever more so trusted nobles filling her colorful court, the King of Kings, Queen of Queens, was ready to do what no man or woman had done before her: become the first person born in the Caucasus to conquer that entire mountain range. There was nothing in her way from stretching Georgia's borders as far as the cliffs would take them. Although it had taken some 8 years, with all odds against her, Tamar Meppe had overcome unceasing internal conflict, whether that be a troublesome ex-husband, a particular group of aristocratic merchants, idealist thinkers on government, or an elderly Catholicos unwilling to let go of power. Now, with nothing but hand-picked loyalty surrounding her and with the help of a handful of military geniuses, Tamar Meppe and the mountains she and millions of others called home would undergo an incredible transformation. By the time her life work was complete, Georgia and Tamar's names would spread far and wide. A renaissance of blood and gold would spur the Georgians into the peak of this golden age. Within much of the next 2 decades, Georgia would find itself in a series of mostly victorious wars that would take them to places they had no idea even existed. This means that much of this story, Tamar's story, is left in the hands of the prowess of her greatest generals. The most important, perhaps not the most skilled, despite showing some promise, was her love and husband, David Soslan. Coming from warrior horse lord stock himself, the Elenian prince, and now Georgian king, Soslan was every bit the leader on the battlefield as his wife was in the palace. The following near 2 decades of expansion all started with what appeared to be a powerful foe struggling to survive. The only other nation in the Caucasus that could realistically match the Georgian army was, of course, the Eldaguzids, who centered themselves around much of modern-day Azerbaijan and spreading through vassal states into Iran and Iraq. With their great founder Eldaguz dead for some time, his successors were okay. But in 1191 they found themselves under the sway of a weak Atabeg. This would result in assassination from his own brother, and forcing another younger brother into exile in Shirvan. The new sultan in question was a man named Abu Bakr, and he was determined to make a name for himself, if not for his own legitimacy. Soslan, seemingly to mark the birth of his son, George Lasha, invaded the Eldaguzids in their northernmost point, taking a swath of land before turning his campaign in the opposite direction. In a move mirroring his wife's old ex-husband, the king turned his army to the Saltikids of Erzurum. The campaign had initial progress, but its ultimate goal of conquering Erzurum had failed. Despite this, Sazlan returned rewarded for his campaign, not through complete victories, but war loot. As the Georgians celebrated that night, little did they all know just exactly what Sazlan had triggered. Atabeg Abu Bakr sent emissaries to his number one vassal, the Caliph of Baghdad. For his liege, he declared holy jihad on Tamar's Georgia. Since the previous jihad that David IV had broke at Didgori, some 70 years had gone and went. Now the Christian god had found another servant, named David, to slay what would become a Goliath of a coalition. All the local Muslim powers joined, as well as a large portion of the Eldeguzid's southern vassals. But there was one key difference this time around. Georgia was no longer the underdog. They were the sustained power to beat. But then, in this century filled with terrible and devastating earthquakes, striking at inopportune or opportune times depending on which side you're rooting for, here came yet another. This time, nature struck at Shirvan, which just so happened to be not only the majority Muslim province, but also the most exposed to an Eldeguzid invasion. Of course, in war one can never miss an opportunity, not even with the unforgiving nature of natural disasters. Of course, Abu Bakr took his jihad north, into Shirvan. Tamar's loyal cousin and vassal subject, Shirvan Shah Ag Sartan, requested aid in all forms to save this jewel on the Caspian. It's at this moment where Tamar reluctantly plays her trump card. After much debate in the Darbazi, the Bagrationi crown would support their own candidate for the Eldeguzid Atabegate. The exiled younger brother of Abu Bakr, Amir Mirhan, with Georgian support, gathered his own Eldeguzid army to fight alongside their most consistently engaged rival. By 1193, the Georgian armies had mobilized. A reinforcement force was sent to hold the line in Shirvan. But they had been doing well enough. The earthquake had its benefits as well. A number of landslides had cut off a few key mountain passes, and forced the jihad to take an alternative and less traveled route. The main army, under Sazlan and Marshal Zakar, marched henceforth into the Eldeguzid realm from where their previous campaign had left off. What followed on both of these fronts was a bunch of bloody skirmishes for the next year, neither side wanting to make the first move. Not so far away, in the city of Aran, a notoriously hard province to take, the newly appointed local governor was more than willing to take this initial step. His name was Yuri Bogolyubsky, Tamar's twice exiled and once defeated ex-husband from Russia. Now, the child prince of Novgorod would govern an Islamic city, working for the majority owners of Iran. Say what you will about Yuri, but his life was never boring. I don't think I can remember anyone who's governed cities for 3 different kingdoms over a 1,000-mile stretch. Yuri gathered the army of Aran and made way into Georgia. I'm not sure if he thought half the empire would just side with him and rebel against Tamar again, but his actions do seem to match this. Despite his small army, Yuri sacked the city of Kambachan. Then the local ducal army popped up and swept Yuri's army, taking the ex-king of Georgia prisoner and sending him off to Tbilisi for his punishment. Yuri would be imprisoned for the rest of his life, but his tomb has never been found. Some say he's still drinking Golden Age wine by the barrel. At this point, the king and the marshal had split their armies, with Sazlan continuing deeper into modern-day Azerbaijan and Zakar going west with the goal of liberating his Armenian countrymen. Success was found at Ambert Fortress, one of few Armenian castles I would consider defensible in the present day. Zakar pushed all the way to the Araxes River before receiving word from Sazlan to rejoin the main army. The jihad had redirected from Shirvan and was on course to gather just ahead of the king's position at the fortress of Shamkor. When Zakar arrived at the war camp, he found the banners of Shirvan and of Amir Mirhan already flying in the wind. With this combined force, the Georgians now nearly matched their jihading counterpart in numbers, a far cry from the fields of Didgori. Georgia had tried and failed to take this fort that guarded the city of Ganja. Not even David IV himself could crack through it. They had conquered it before, but only after one of those aforementioned well-timed earthquakes. Attempting a frontal assault on this fortress would be near suicidal. But it appeared this was the plan of action. Anton Nolas Davidzi, the Chancellor of Georgia himself and a man like another father to Tamar Mepe, led the army to the walls, grasping a giant cross in perfect crusader fashion, with 2 heavily armored shieldmen blocking him from arrow fire. Zakar, the Shirvanites, and Amir Mirhan struck the walls with ladders and attempted storming them. They were held back, but made enough of an impression to force the defenders to divert their attention and send reinforcements from other portions of the wall to fill the gaps. But this initial assault was just the carrot to a stick. David Soslan had taken a portion of the army, including his elite Elanian and Manaspa horsemen. He marched around Shamkor, the defenders' view of his force blocked by mountains and forests. Poor scouting work on the part of the Georgians saw Soslan arrive at the opposite side of Shamkor late. That day, Zakar was forced to sacrifice many men. For if he retreated, this meant the endangerment of King Soslan. When eventually Soslan did show, he rushed the southern gates and captured them, surrounded the enemy, and pinched them between his coalition, eventually breaking them, resulting in a surrender en masse. This victory was celebrated as if it was another Didgori, and it guaranteed the same things. Having crushed and sold their armies into slavery, Georgia was now open to conquer all of its neighbors with relative ease. But somehow, Abu Bakr had slipped out of the fortress. No matter the case, his personal standard was seized and immediately sent back to Tamar Mepe. She then donated it to a Tbilisian monastery, the ultimate sign of triumph over a jihad. The Shirvanites went home to repair their earthquake-devastated cities, while Zakar and his brother Ivan went west, off to seize more of Armenia, while the picking was easy. Soslan marched through the gates of Ganja, not the ones in Jaladi Monastery, unopposed, placed himself on the Sultan's throne where he and his army celebrated their great victory. It's safe to say the global percentage of wine on earth went down a fraction that night. Amir Mirhan was given ownership of the city under his own Eldaguzid banner. Then he dropped dead a few weeks later, poisoned by his own brother. At this point, Soslan was already returning home. Abu Bakr regathered what remained of his coalition and managed to retake Ganja, somewhat snubbing the recent victory. But Abu Bakr no longer had the manpower to retake Shamkor fortress. Soslan turned the Georgian army around and faced Abu Bakr again at the Battle of Beylagan. Siege warfare had not worked for him, so he took his chances on the battlefield, and here too, the Atabeg was defeated. Abu Bakr at this point told his ministers to just stop informing him of Georgian victories. Then he just got drunk. I mean, fair enough. The man killed both of his brothers and was still losing everything. From here, David and the Zaccharid brothers just go on a complete conquering spree. In 1196, the Zakharids seized the city of Galukan, going further and further south and adding more and more to their army through Armenian volunteers. A few months after this, Soslan captured Ganja and then retook Nakhchivan, where Abu Bakr had made his wartime stronghold. With this, the last cornerstone trade city of the Caucasus along the Silk Road fell into the empire. Tbilisi in the middle to connect it all, Kutaisi for the Black Sea trade, Baku on the Caspian, and now Nakhchivan for the south. This defeat pacified much of the Altaguzid lands north of the Araxes, as well as the Jihad, as many members abandoned their Altaguzid ally. The Saltikids of Erzurum even became a Georgian vassal to escape future war. Finally, they gave up. Meanwhile, Zakharid Warrior Brothers Incorporated were systematically sweeping through Armenia like a hot knife through butter. In 1199, an elusive Armenian city, who had been somewhat loyal to the Bagrationi these past few years, declared independence. Somehow, someone, claiming to be a member of the Shaddadid dynasty, reappeared and won the city to his side. Man, I really thought we were done with these guys. The Shaddadid Kurdish dynasties had betrayed so many people, mostly the Georgians, as they clung onto a few lucrative cities in Armenia for over 200 years. Amir Mahmud played his ancestral card and petitioned the quickly approaching Zakharid army that he would become a faithful vassal of Georgia. But Zakhar was not duped. He retook the city, and Tamar granted him the ownership. And with that, the Shaddadids are now finally over. I hope. With Zakhar in control, the citizens of Ani finally had a governor they could get behind. From the Zakharid war spoils, many of Ani's ruined churches and buildings would be restored, bringing new life to this old capital. At the turn of the century in 12,000, Sazlan returned home after beating Georgia's most threatening rival to a pulp. Meanwhile, these Zakharids never stopped. The city of Devin fell a few months after Ani. With the Altaguzids and all of their Islamic neighbors in shambles, and with the subsequent land grab, Georgia had just went from new empire on the block to a power on the Eurasian world stage. But when you move up a bracket, there always comes fiercer competition. The case would be no different here. Another band of Seljuks had found more success than their eastern counterpart, and now they shared a border with Georgia. The Sultanate of Rum, translated to Rome, was ready to take down the Far Eastern Christians. After uniting a few Turkish lords in Anatolia under their banner, namely the Danishmends and later the Artikids, the Rum Sultans took advantage of the weakening Eastern Roman Empire and conquered the predominantly Greek center of Pontus. But the border with Georgia crept its way through the interior of Anatolia. Without any warning, Sultan Rukan ad-Din outright conquered the Saltikids of Erzurum, giving his brother the region before appointing him as co-sultan, thereby ending the century-long rule of the Saltikids. The Saltikids never really had much luck in terms of politics or in the battlefield, but like the Georgians, they happened to produce a female ruler in this same time. Mama Hatun was the daughter of Emir Saltuk II. If you remember, he was the guy that was ransomed by both King Demetrius and his son, George III. And like Tamar, her counterpart commissioned beautiful buildings to be built. Perhaps the last Saltikids ever built, in fact, was her magnificent tomb. It takes inspiration from Ani of all places and remains mostly intact today. Like Tamar in Georgian history, Mama Hatun stands out in Turkish history as a handful of female rulers, and a well-respected one at that. What are the chances that they would rule next door to each other at the same time? She's still celebrated to this very day, and appears as a common character in local legends, just like Tamar. Rukan ad-Din followed up his conquest by sending a letter and a gift of all things to Tamar Meppe. The contents of this letter promised all-out warfare if the Georgians did not make concessions with the Rum. After sending her own gifts and kindly rejecting the Sultan, he sent another letter. The envoy again delivered it to the Queen of Queens. This time, Rukan ad-Din hit the lowest chord he could have, calling every woman feeble-minded, and Tamar in particular, a simpleton of a queen. But Tamar was the ultimate killer with kindness, so she responded rather taunting. You rely on gold and numerous warriors. I on God's power. A final envoy was sent to Tbilisi. Out loud, the envoy read in the middle of the court that Rukin ad-Din wished to marry the queen if she converted to Islam, and if she had no desire in that regard, she could join his harem as a Christian. Zakar Zakarian was the first to jump from the queen's side. He grabbed the envoy and beat the shit out of him, and threatened to give him a Georgian necktie if not for respect of diplomatic immunity. As the bleeding envoy scurried away, Zakar made a clear declaration of war. The Darbazi immediately called for war with the Rum after that. Rukin ad-Din had no idea just how invested the Georgians were with their queen. After disgracing her as a monarch and by gender, the response was the largest Georgian army assembled in all of history. An unbelievable 60,000 men came to Tbilisi to defend the honor of their beloved Mepe. As per her custom, Tamar would lead the army to the closest monastery deemed safe from the conflict. This meant they were going to the cave city cliff complex of Vardzia, where a relief of Tamar and her father ruling side by side was already painted. The soldiery amassed in the valley. Tamar took a step out onto the balcony overlooking all of them. Here she gave what was probably an epic speech, although any first-hand account has gone unrecorded. I felt, though, that this most climactic moment in Tamar's story couldn't go without a speech, so I made my best rendition. The Sultan of so-called Rome has disrespected my name, title, and our faith. All this, and they don't even own Rome. They took what was our Roman allies' land, and now they come for Georgia's. Will you let them? In this time of need, tell me, are you a Kartvelian, or a Kantvelian, Armenian, or Artmenian, a Shirvanite, or a Shirvanot? Are you a Laney in, or a Laney out? Will you Dagestan or Dagesit? Okay, yeah, okay, let me just stop. But seriously, with this region, I could do this all day with these names. Tamar waved and rejoiced, celebrating with the cheerings of 60,000 before she walked back into Vardzia Monastery to pray for these same men. King Consort David Soslan then led another outnumbered force out of the Georgian heartland. Accompanying him were practically all notable Georgian commanders of the period. Of course, the Zakharid brothers Ivan and Zakar, then Ivan Torelli, son of a previous marshal, a popular poet and noble warrior, Sargis Tamogveli, and then there are the relative newcomers to the Georgian political scene, themselves an offshoot of the Torelli, the Alazikeli brothers, the older being Shava and the younger being yet another Ivan. The Georgian army was in very good hands, and the best part about it is that Rukin ad-Din had no idea they were coming. For the following Battle of Bassiani, David Soslan would take a play straight out of the book of David IV. The preemptive strike would occur in the middle of the night. The Georgians sent an advanced cavalry detachment to swarm the enemy camp. The Rum awoke and fended them off, but then came into view the entire Georgian army, arrayed how they would be on a map. Abkhazians on the far left flank with Heretians and Shirvanites on the right. The Alazikeli brothers held the middle, and Ivan on either flank, Zakharid and Torelli, arguably the most battle-proven Zakar, holding the retreat watching the youngins win the glory. Soslan just in front of him held a reserve cavalry behind the middle line consisting of his elite guard. The Georgians marched on their foe, who somehow managed to assemble for battle in time. But these groggy men were not in proper formation, and the Georgian cavalry swung in from either flank. As the center infantry rolled in, the heavy armored cavalry flanks dismounted to fight on foot. Soslan watched as this battle turned into a mosh pit. The Georgians made advances, nearly encircling their foe until the Rum finally woke up. They started to fight back, and soon one of the Ivan flanks started to fall. Torelli. Soslan took the opportunity and once again led a charge that completely devastated the enemy. This started a rout and won yet another outnumbered battle. Sultan Rukin ad-Din retreated as the Georgians ran him down back to Anatolia for 6 days. The entire Rum camp and its loot from Byzantine provinces fell into Tamar's hands, as well as the standard of another rival. Those who surrendered were sold into slavery, including the Sultan's vassal emir of similarly named Erzurum, Erzin Khan. He was sold for a single horseshoe, and an iron one at that. Tamar used a large portion of the profits to remodel Vardzia. While it was a fort under her father, she would turn it into a masterpiece maze of a religious and communal site. All of this while keeping it a defensible structure. Seriously, this looks like something straight out of The Lord of the Rings. With the loot from the Rum camp also came more advanced and secretly kept knowledge from the Muslim world. A book on medicine would be found and ordered to be transcribed by Anton Nolastovidze, George III and Tamar's long-term chancellor. This alone would pay off more than any piece of gold-encrusted jewelry. The resulting manuscript would come to save thousands of lives, as Georgia had no great advancements in the world of medicine previous to this. For old Anton, this would be his last great and perhaps most lasting achievement. After serving the Bagrationi as chancellor over a 30-year period, the old partially warrior bishop who held the cross at Shamkor would die. He would be succeeded as chancellor by the Catholicos Patriarch, Theodore II. But to not make another problem like Catholicos Chancellor Michael IV, Theodore first stepped down from his position as Catholicos in order to become chancellor. Treating the highest religious office like a training ground for imperial office seemed a viable strategy. Over the course of that next year, the Georgian army split and went rather unusually west and along the Black Sea. Here, a quiet, although powerful neighbor would enter the fold. The Circassians, directly to the north, shared a long and fruitful alliance with Georgia. But when the fiercely independent Circassians were presented with a rare prospect of joining an empire of one of their own friends, plenty took the deal. The more mercantile-minded Circassians, especially those on the coast, joined the empire, tribe by tribe, as tributaries. And that was really all Georgia wanted from them. The Kabardians and Circassians' heartland was still very much so out of the Georgian hands. Bottom line, you know you're doing something right if the Circassians willingly join your empire, because they would rather go through a genocide than do that, at least with Russia. The Georgians took this campaign back to the Rum front in 1204, taking advantage of the death of Rukin ad-Din, who was probably so surprised to be beat by a woman that he died. This allowed for the expanding around Byzantium's last holdout in Trebizond. Preparing to reinstigate an old score, Tamar happened to have not one but 2 Eastern Roman emperors just sitting around in her court. These boys were her nephews, Alexios and David Komnenos. Tamar's sister, Rusudan, had married the Byzantine prince and would-be emperor before being dragged through the streets of Constantinople and ripped apart by an angry mob in 1185. A man who had previously visited Georgia during the reign of King George III, Manuel Komnenos. The 25-year-old Alexios and the 23-year-old David invaded Trebizond at the head of a Byzantine Georgian army, and the gates of the city swung open for the Komnenoi. Simply for clout, they changed their last names to Megas Komnenos, or Grand Komnenos, before declaring one of the smallest empires in history, the Empire of Trebizond. Alexios stayed behind in his new capital while the Georgians were not yet finished with David. Shortly after the birth of the Megas Komnenos, the Fourth Crusade ravaged Constantinople and practically destroyed the Byzantine Empire. Reduced to a few splinter states, among them, and with a head start, being the Empire of Trebizond. Tamar ordered for the Georgians to take David along for the ride of his life, a gamble for the city at the center of the world, Constantinople. Long story short, they got most of the way there before encountering Theodore Lascaris and his Empire of Nicaea, another successor state even more well positioned to take Constantinople. The Georgian army slowly withdrew from David's army over the next few years, and David resorted to allying with the Latin Empire that had sacked Constantinople. But still, he was defeated by Lascaris and the resurgent Rome. He would be forced to become a monk and would die a few years later. Alexios, stationed in Trebizond, remained a strong ally and vassal for the rest of Tamar's reign. Although the Komnenoi didn't retake Constantinople, Georgia now had the glory of the legacy that is Rome at their fingertips. A powerful thing, but something slightly more diluted in this uncertain age. After securing Alexios, the Rome campaign ceased after another hearty expansion. Meanwhile, in Armenia, those always active Zaccharid brothers were back at it and attacking Georgia's perpetual rival, the Shah Armenia. Preparing to enter the final stage of this 50-year war, they took the plains of Manzikert, which was hugely symbolic as a win for Christendom, but strategically it was of less importance. The major center had moved south in the ensuing years under the Shah Armenids with their capital city of Klat. Here, the Zakharids struck, besieging the city before yet another Muslim coalition showed up. Detachments from the Rum and the Eldeguzids most notably contributing. Using the city to their advantage, this coalition did manage to defeat the Georgian army, who thereafter withdrew. Still, most would live to fight another day. This army would have likely regrouped and at least held a defensive position, but of all things, religion would force them to abandon the campaign altogether. In this melting pot of an empire of more languages and ethnicities to count, religion had usually been something Georgia was rather enlightened about. Wow, that was a good rhyme. Of course, the Bagrationi and the state religion was the Georgian church, but there was another distinct and similar church, the Armenians. The whole squabble was one that had been playing out for centuries at this point. The nature of Jesus being part human, part God, or all human with some God, yada yada. During the reign of David IV, he had tried in vain to mend these differences and combine the churches, but he had failed. Now the Armenians, who had done so much to build this empire, were refusing to fight for Georgian commanders. Meanwhile, Georgians, who had done so much to liberate the Armenians, were refusing to fight for Armenian generals. Tamar, ever the compromiser, would find a solution to this problem, but for now, she had enough skilled Georgian and Armenian generals to spare. After taking a year to recover from external and internal wounds, the Georgian-Armenian separate armies took the region of Kars at the expense of the Rum, a huge roadblock for both Georgia and Trebizond. Again, these armies swung south and besieged the city of Kalat. This time, no help was coming. They needed a miracle to outlast the Georgians. Ivan Zakarian and a small scouting force decided to take a trip in order to more closely inspect the walls. As they neared closer, the Turks opened the gates and charged directly at Ivan. The scouting force was caught off guard, and Ivan made the split-second decision of flight instead of fight. As they reared their horses, Ivan drifted his into a ditch, and it landed on top of him. As the scouts galloped away, Ivan's older brother Zakhar watched in fright as they approached the fallen horsemen. He was relieved to see that Ivan was alive and seemed to be okay. And then he got really pissed as he was taken prisoner back to the city they were about to siege. He quickly sent a letter. "If you dare to take my brother out of the city or do something to him, I will conquer the land of your country and give it to the Georgian kingdom." Not only this, but Zakhar really knew how to get a point across, ending the letter with a classic, "Oh yeah, and I'm gonna kill all of you." Despite Zakhar's best efforts at threatening his way to recover his brother, Tamar had no problem paying a ransom for one of her prized generals. 100,000 dinars was the price for Ivan alive. Not only this, but for assurance, Ivan's daughter would have to marry the Sultan of Shah Armenia. Checkmate. Somehow they survived another war. But one more, and surely these most resilient of enemies would give up. The Georgian army returned yet again. Again, another year they would delay the campaign, for there were more pressing issues even compared to the religious disputes. David Soslan, king of Georgia and Alania, lifelong lover of Tamar Mepe and father to her children, passed away in 1207, likely dying young, although we do not know his birth date. The pair had been married for 16 years that would turn out to be the most prosperous in Georgian history. Soslan won 2 massive military victories, the odds of which were both not in his favor, defeating Georgia's most powerful enemies with ease. Most importantly, David, unlike Yuri, allowed Tamar to rule and was her biggest supporter. They stand as one of history's greatest power couples. Not to mention, his 2 children secured the Bagrationi dynasty, although technically he may have created his own Soslan dynasty. But Tamar's aunt Rusudan did adopt him, and he was partially Bagrationi already by blood. Come to mention, I forgot to talk about the demise of Tamar's influential aunt Rusudan. But this is because she simply disappears from historical records, likely dying sometime around the turn of the 12th century. So the question stands, was Georgia under an Alanian dynasty after this? I would say no, but technically, yeah, they kinda were. But technically Tamar was a female king, so the Georgians had no problems bending the rules to support their ambitions. Unfortunately, with the death of her husband, Tamar appears less and less in historically verifiable sources, perhaps taking a step out of the limelight and allowing others to step into it. Her son George Lasha would reign alongside his mother just as Tamar had her father. Lasha was only 15 upon his coronation. His princely education was not even over, not to mention the military training the job demanded. To fill David Soslan's role would be the likely still recovering ego of Ivan Zakarian. Tamar created a new official role in her court, the tutor, tasked with raising the Bagrationi spawn, as well as any other royal children, perhaps hostages that found themselves in Tbilisi. For Ivan to secure this spot, he needed to focus his full attention onto it, so Tamar replaced him with his own vassal, Vache Vachetian. He would remain in his spot for the rest of Tamar's reign, using his newfound wealth to construct 2 of Armenia's most beautiful monasteries, which, for your amusement, I will now attempt to say. Sagmosavank Monastery and Havhanvank Monastery. At any rate, Ivan would undergo another, more massive change than a job title. He would take David Soslan's spot not only as tutor, but in the army. To settle the Georgian-Armenian religious conflict plaguing the otherwise efficient military, Ivan converted to Georgian Orthodoxy, baptized by the new Catholicos, the rather hardline Orthodox John. Now the Zacharids could lead both Georgians and Armenians. Soslan was good, but this was a scary prospect, even if Ivan was half as good a general as his brother. Ivan's daughter was still married to the Shah Armen, which would prevent any future invasions. But then, poof. Suddenly they were gone and Georgia had nothing to do with it. The Ayyubid ruler, commonly known as Safaddin, like his uncle Saladin, took Kalat and immediately made word to Tamar, reassuring the Georgian Darbazi that there was still nothing to fear from the Ayyubids. The following year, a proper treaty was strung out, taking a step toward alliance with the Ayyubids, as they agreed on a 30-year truce with Georgia, also agreeing to split the region of Armenia through the middle, north to south. A free, albeit minor land grab, and at least one friendly face in the south to show for it. But even more numerous were the enemies here, and even more ferocious did they grow. On Easter Sunday, the Sultan of Ardabil, a breakaway state of the Aldeguzids, ambushed the city of Ani, its gates wide open for the celebration. The results were total eluding as the life work of the Zaccharid brothers restoring the city was flushed right down the drain. You just pissed off the wrong Armenians. Ivan and Zakhar, leading Georgian and Armenian armies respectively, paid the Sultan a visit on Ramadan, looted his capital, and slayed him, conquering Georgia's farthest southeastern outpost. But like I said, the Zakharids were pissed. They had spent so much money on Antony, they intended to go to the ends of the earth to get it back, plus some. The brothers marched past Ardabil, farther east and south, taking cities and plundering them before moving on to the next. Eventually, these cities simply started surrendering and paid tribute to avoid a ransacking, largest and most notable being Tabriz. The Zakharians then reached a fork in their road called the Alborz Mountains. Here they sent letter for Tamar asking permission if they could go forward, which she granted. Here, they could take the safe route to the north along the Caspian coast, or they could go south through the unknown of inner Iran. But let's be real here, there was only one option for these brothers. So of course they took the southern route, plundering, pillaging, and gaining surrender as the fear of their name spread far and wide. At one point, the Zakharids simply got lost. They had no idea where they were with Georgian maps and were hearing names they had never heard in Iranic languages they had no direct translators for. So do you think they turned back? Of course not! They marched the length of the Alborz Mountains before going north and finally reaching the salty shores of the Caspian, after a long 2 years of what was becoming one of Georgia's greatest campaigns. After reaching the coast and something of a supply line, the Georgians raided their way across the southern Caspian. Finally, after 3 whole years, the Zakharids' armies reached Georgian soil. Acting like a couple of Xenophons, the Zakharids returned from what was likely the most enriching campaign in Georgian history. They only stopped because they had too much loot to carry and no supply line to carry it back for them. Wow. This would be enough to restore Antony yet again. But Tamar made sure everyone got a slice, giving it away to the poor and downtrodden, as well as donations to churches and through noble endowments. Not even a year after returning from the campaign that would cement his legacy as one of Georgia's and Armenia's greatest generals, Zakhar Zakharian would pass away, like Sazlan, relatively young. To replace the longtime marshal, Tamar offered the seat to the next best thing that was his brother, but he rejected, requesting Tamar instead make his young nephew, Zakhar's son, Shah Zakharian, the head of the army instead. Tamar accepted. Ivan did not decline the offer solely out of the goodness of his heart, though. While it may have seemed that Shah was the head of the army, it was actually his uncle in another newly created role tailored to him. Ivan Zakharian would become an Atabeg? The originally Turkish title was used to denote the tutor of kings before they themselves started ruling their own countries, in the case of the Eldeguzids. Its rank in the Georgian court was a new top, the highest and most respected office with powers overstretching from finance to military. The Atabeg could only be home to the most loyal of subjects. Ivan would remain in this role for the rest of his life. Using his new powers, there was one last conquest the Georgian Empire needed to secure: the Greater Caucasus and the vital mountain passes from north to south. The last roadblock was another coalition of northern native peoples. The Derdzuk, Chechens, Avars, Ingush, and any of the other multitudes of ethnic groups in the northeast Caucasus once again banded together in an effort to take down their overgrown neighbor. The last 5 times this did not go well, but independence was far more important than winning for these particular people. Ivan Zakharian made mincemeat of them. First, he went straight for the middle, cut off the Chechens, and surrendered them out of the war in mere months. Then he moved to the east until reaching Shirvan, and by the time he went to take out the Ingush, they were already calling for peace. Thus, the last big land grab in Tamar's reign had been completed. Take a good look at this map. because this is the biggest the Kingdom of Georgia would ever be, stretching just over 1,000 miles from Crimea to Ardabil and spanning the length of the Caucasus. I do believe this is the nicest looking, most geographically correct empire in history, and I love it. It's straight up map porn. Over the course of this video, I focused mostly on the military and political scene. I felt like it was necessary to split such a large video. But talking about these great generals makes you miss the reason they were even in their positions in the first place. We must remember this is a story of court politics at its heart. There's some chivalry, and nobles doing all they can to impress and honor their queen. While Tamar was active leading armies on marches, by far her most important contributions were to making a better, happier society for her subjects. Tamar donated, built, and added on to a multitude of monasteries and other religious sites. Might I mention Vardzia again as a crowning achievement, but there was also extensive renovations on Shiomigvi Monastery and Gelati itself. A highlight of Tamar's architecture was extremely large domes, something architects could only dream of having the knowledge to create in the preceding centuries, at least in Georgia. Not to mention the churches outside of Georgia, Tamar used her own purse to donate to. Of course, in Jerusalem, Tamar gave the most. But as far as Egypt and on the coast of Bulgaria did Tamar give to her Orthodox kin. Tamar also gave her nobles permission to build their own churches en masse, which they gladly did. She was also a whole subject on herself. We can only look to the art of the queen to see this. Church songs praise her, poets portrayed her as the ultimate monarch, Persian titles were adapted and placed into them was Tamar. It's safe to say that she might have just been the biggest celebrity of her day. Her name was known far and wide, her deeds coming ever greater through the poets that made her immortal, beyond life and into fiction. Heck, there was even a few North Caucasus tribes that literally put her in the pantheon of gods as a fertility goddess. A compromise to Georgian missionaries I'm sure Tamar got a blush out of. But we must remember where and when Tamar ruled. In the Islam and male-dominated societies of the Middle East, she ruled as a female, the ultimate contrast of her time. Some saw through their own religion, like Saladin and his Ayyubid family, and made friends with this unique monarch, while others, like Rukn ad-Din, had to learn the hard way that a woman could rule just as well as many men could. While Tamar, in my opinion, was the perfect monarch, she was never a fully authoritative one, always advised by her court officials and generals. This allowed her to have a hands-off approach in war. Letting her husband and those Zaccharid wolves run free may have just been Tamar's most impressive compromise. She balanced feudalism like no other. Tamar, with her host of strong men at her back, allowed herself to be the most forgiving of rulers. Her father's harsh laws for criminals were ended, along with the death penalty and even torture, unless you committed treason. That was an exception. Tamar used this forgiving nature to kill the Caucasus with kindness. The mountains of hundreds of languages and peoples could not be brought together by the harsh punishment of the father. Only under a mother like Tamar, history proves this is the only way this could work. And when the forgiving didn't work, then a bunch of mountain men would enslave your people and hunt you down. Tamar's open-mindedness created a multi-ethnic melting pot of an empire, something of a utopia where everyone had a fair chance and everyone pretty much got along. Tamar had her favorites though, and those were of course the Georgians and Armenians. They were the powerhouses of the empire after all, and tied together through a common history. She perfectly mixed these peoples together and put them on equal footing in the same kingdom like never before. Even when religion became a conflict between the two groups, Tamar found a compromise that made everyone happy in the end. Unlike many other Georgian kings, with the exception of the start of her reign, Tamar was a meritocratic appointer and a damn good one at that, giving loyal, not yet famous or fabulously wealthy noble families a chance to shine. Because of this and Tamar's own donations to the churches, common folk, the downtrodden, and everyone in between, the people of the empire became wealthy. The amount of class advancement at this time was unprecedented. Farmers could become nobles, nobles grand dukes, homeless could finally purchase a plot of land for themselves. Quality of life only went up. This wealth, of course, was gathered on campaign, but mostly from trade. The empire now sat on a massive nexus of the Silk Road with so many trading cultures like Jews, Armenians, Abkhazians, etc. They finally had a chance to use their expertise on a global stage. Chances are, if you needed something shipped to or from Europe to China, using the Georgian route, either the Caspian or Black Seas and along the mountains would be the quickest and safest way to do it. Alternatively, if you needed to get from northern Eurasia anywhere south on foot, you had to use a Georgian pass. No one ever controlled these crossroads with impunitive authority in the same way Tamar did. While balancing all these things, Tamar also balanced her very gender. While she was a woman, she played the role of a king, so she always had to make sure she acted as such. Any minor slip-up would see her lose face. She walked an asexual line, sitting on both the throne of a king and a queen, juggling both roles at the same time when most could never do one just as well. Tamar's golden age can only be described fully in the fiction of poets, because this world she created might as well have been one. No one living in the war-torn Caucasus could imagine living in such a paradise as this. This was an age of chivalry, an age of unexpected heroes and good vibes. Tamar was the champion of the Messiah and the ruler of the mountains. But all good things must come to an end. Perhaps since the death of Soslan and Tamar's subsequent step from the limelight, she was not only suffering from loss, but a mysterious disease that the best doctors could only help to ease. The increasing amount of pain coming from the stomach region. Many fingers point to cancer due to the longevity of this illness. But we all know Tamar was nothing if not a fighter. Even when she was finally forced to concede defeat at last, she did it in the most nonchalant, most professional, politicized way. Unexpectedly, the now frail Mepe interrupted her Darbazi council, and as if excusing herself from the dinner table, warned of her, quote, feminine infirmity, and not to worry about her in a time of non-stop warfare. She then walked to seat herself on a chair where she would be carried to the Bagrationi Palace in Tbilisi, and that was the last time the nobility ever saw her. Tamar only made one more official decree after her more than earned retirement. God forbid if something happened to her only son, like, a stray arrow to the chest, there was no legitimate Bagrationi to succeed him yet. Tamar then named her daughter Rusudan as confirmed third in line for the throne. Within a few weeks of this, Tamar the Great passed on into the next life in January of 1213. She would live on forever, and very soon after would be canonized as a saint, officially named Holy Righteous Queen Tamar. You may think this is where Tamar's story naturally ends, but her existence was so that her story transcends life itself. One mystery still and has always eluded us. Where is her tomb? We have 3 major suspicions but no confirmations as to where her final resting place might be. A letter from a French crusader in the Holy Land told of a young King George bringing his mother's body to Jerusalem on pilgrimage with him, as Tamar never got to in her lifetime. The story goes she was buried in the cathedral of the holy monastery that she donated so much money to in her lifetime. This letter has a dating problem, but to support this theory, 2 female skeletons were found in the monastery, but their DNA was not tested. If one of these is Tamar, then who's the other? My guess is as good as yours, but I'm going to take a pretty wild guess here. Tamar is long dead and a few times over great aunt, Byzantine Empress Maria of Alania. I only say this because her father, King Bagrat IV, largely built the Jerusalem monastery with his own funds. And we also do not have a recorded place for her burial. But like I said, this is just a guess. Another suggestion that may have already been disproven is that Tamar Mepe was buried alongside David Soslan in his Alanian homeland. I say may have been disproven because in 1946 an archaeologist discovered a tomb in Nuzal Chapel with Georgian inscription that said Soslan on it. And they found no Tamar alongside this burial. Of course, Soslan was a popular name in Alania, so this could very well belong to another man or even prince named Soslan. While the rest of the world hasn't accepted this theory, the Ossetians have. But we will not know until more experienced archaeologists could perhaps carbon date something in the tomb or present a skeleton for DNA. So if Tamar isn't in Jerusalem or Alania, then she must be in the most obvious spot. Although she must have been hidden, so she may never be disturbed. It only makes sense for Tamar to be buried in Gelati Monastery, with the past 3 kings and her ancestors. But where? Perhaps in the floor like her great-grandfather David IV? In the walls? Did they hang her from the rafters? We don't know. Anti-Soviet Georgian writer Grigol Robakidze once wrote, "Thus far, nobody knows where Tamar's grave is. She belongs to everyone and no one. Her grave is the heart of the Georgian, and in the Georgian's perception, this is not a grave, but a beautiful vase in which an unfading flower, the great Tamar, flourishes. Although the search for Tamar's tomb is not over, it does not matter, because her memory lives so vividly in the present day." It seems safe for me to say that no queen means more to their people than Tamar to Georgia. So many things are named after her. Some of Georgia's most traveled streets, World War II legions, plays, songs, the game Civilization VI, fucking Age of Empires 2, the Georgian 50 lari bill. If you go to Tbilisi today, she's simply everywhere. And that is her tomb. Tamar Bagrationi, despite setbacks and disadvantages early in life, had done the impossible. A woman had not only unified the entire Caucasus mountain region, but also tamed it like no one else could before or after her. But her story is more than just an empire. What she created was a mythos for herself and country. Georgia was viewed through the lens of a panther's skin now. What we must remember most, and I've said it before because it is important not to lose sight of this, is that this is a story of court politics, and Tamar was the most successful and kindest Machiavellian to throw her crown into this ring. She is simply the greatest cultural leader in Georgian history, and that will never, ever change. Her many accomplishments and good deeds grant her a spot among history's greatest female monarchs. No Elizabeth nor Victoria, Isabella's or Wilhelmina's, no Cleopatra Boudica, not even Catherine, the other queen named the Great, can compare to the wide-arcing advancement Georgia underwent during the reign of Tamar. She is the harbinger of the Golden Age. The Georgian Renaissance probably would have never happened under another in the same way it played out with Tamar. Now, let's end this how we started it. Cue the Shoto Rostaveli. Their kingly mercy was given to all. It fell like endless snow. The poor stopped begging. Widows felt safe. Orphans were helped to grow. Evildoers were scared. Their ewes had lambs, but no milk to bestow. In the realm of their kingdom, the goat with the wolf could safely go. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Matvasian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, Dan Lenar, and Moist Lord. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent. What? Why? Nick Matvasian again, GOD, Heath Dion, Carl Brandian, Layla, and GOK. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I really, really appreciate it. This has been like a 2-year journey to get to this point in the Georgian series, and oh my god, I never thought I would get this far.